I'm in the process of putting together a collection display of vintage and antique children's games, and I've just started putting the pieces together actually. And I have three sitting before me here that are interesting. Of course, one is a dice game and a cup, and as far as I can make out, it's called Deadbeat. And it consists of a cup, metal top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 dice with different letters marked on them, very crudely marked on them, I might add. And I'm thinking that one's from, maybe 1915, 1920. And then I have a small card game called Lotto, and that I believe goes back to the 1920s also. And then a small deck of cards called Authors. It was published by Whitman, who also did books and things, but I'm thinking that one's probably no older than the 1960s, but it's the beginning. But as I was looking through things pertaining to vintage and antique games, I came across an article that appeared in Women's Sports of November 1975, and it's called A History of Board Games by Colleen M. Taylor. And so the text of that follows after the jiggies outside quit honking their horns because they're too freaking lazy to get out of their car and go knock on a door. Imagine a group of our ancient ancestors are sitting around the recently discovered phenomenon known as fire on a Friday night, chewing on a bone, and while discussing the events of the day, someone notices that when a sheep's knuckle bone is thrown on the ground, it lands on any one of its four flat but differently shaped sides. Almost immediately, a Cro-Magnon, Jimmy the Greek, begins placing wagers on the outcome of the tosses, recording his wins and losses with marks on the sandy floor of the cave. Soon, the simple marks are replaced by a track upon which pebbles, fruit, stones, and or beans are moved to keep score. Centuries pass. Now the sides of the knuckle bones are rubbed smooth and assigned numbers. Dice have been created. The track is transformed to a wooden board for added permanence. The pebbles used to keep score are now the focus of the game, and the first player to move their counter around the track is declared the winner. The race game was born. Enshrouded in the mist of bygone eons, lurking in the most historical of legends, are the forerunners of Monopoly, snakes and ladders, Chinese checkers. Board games are probably more ancient than boards. Some anthropologists trace them back to ancient divinatory rites and magical practices. Herodotus records that the Lydians developed dice and board games in an effort to allay their hunger pangs during famine, while Homer tells us that Ulysses created games to relieve his troops of boredom during their siege of Troy. On the walls of ancient Egyptian pyramids are paintings depicting nobles absorbed in one of their favorite recreations, the game of dogs and jackals, played on an oval, perforated board similar to the type used in modern cribbage. The game consisted of racing two sets of pieces, the dog and the jackals, around the board according to the throws of 6 appropriately pyramid-shaped dice. These were carved out of bone, ivory, and occasionally semi-precious stones. If a piece landed on a specially marked square, it could jump to a point further ahead, exactly as in snakes and ladders. Another Egyptian game, Robbers, appears to have been an early ancestor of backgammon. Each player moved a set of 10 men around a long, narrow board, 2 or 3 squares wide by 10 squares long, the object being to bring the men home as quickly as possible. Pieces could be bumped if another landed on the same square, or piled up to avoid capture. Similar games were later played throughout the ancient world. The Persians were enthralled with the backgammon-like game called Nard in the 3rd century A.D. Roman aristocrats were fanatic devotees of tabula tables. In fact, the Emperor Claudius wrote an entire book of tabula. Unwilling to leave the game for a minute, he went so far as to have a board attached to his carriage so that he could play while traveling. Nero, too, was an addict. Once, when losing heavily, he ran out into the street, confiscated the property of the first two Romans he met, and returned to the game, announcing that this was the best move he had made all evening. The ancient Hindus were fanatic gamblers, ready to wager an arm or a leg on a game's outcome, literally. Occasionally, a player who had been cleaned out would play with a pot of boiling medicine at his side. If his losses continued, he would cut off a finger or limb, plunge what was left into the liquid and to cauterize it, and return to the game. The Indians invented many board games, including Parcheesi, which has existed almost unchanged since the 2nd century AD. The Mughal emperors of the 16th and 17th centuries were so enraptured by this game that they were known to lay out life-size boards in their palace courtyards and play using harem girls as pieces. India was also the birthplace of what its adherents claim is the most intellectually demanding of all games. One legend has it that chess was invented by Buddhist priests who wanted their ruler to settle disputes without bloodshed. According to another story, when a queen's favorite son had been killed, the people of her kingdom went to a philosopher for help in breaking the news to her. The philosopher then invented chess, and when the queen heard of the new game, she asked him to teach it to her. The philosopher won, and when he announced, Shamat, the king is dead, the modern term checkmate is a corruption of this phrase, the queen apparently got the message. The actual circumstances surrounding the invention of chess remains a mystery, but we do know that in the 6th century AD, a four-handed gambling game called Chaturanga, or the Four Armies, appeared in northern India, and it was played on an 8x8 square board borrowed from the earlier gambling game Ashtapada, and the pieces represented the four divisions of the Indian army: foot soldiers, horses, chariots, or today's rooks, and elephants, today's bishops, led by a king and his vizier, or prime minister. Which piece could be moved each turn was determined by a throw of the dice. A 2, for instance, meant a player could move his king, a 3 his elephant, and so on. A century or so later, a two-handed version superseded the four-handed game, and the dice were eliminated, either because of a religious ban on gambling or because players found the game even more exciting without the element of luck. Chess spread to Russia, the Far East, and Persia, and when the Arabs conquered Persia in the 7th century, they assimilated the games they found there and spread them throughout their huge empire. Chess, Parcheesi, and backgammon reached Europe through Moorish territory in Spain and southern Italy in the 11th century. Shortly afterwards, the game of checkers was born in the south of France, the offspring of chess and al-Qurqu, an Arab game which resembles Chinese checkers. Although the church tried its best to ban such games, they caught on like wildfire among the European upper classes. Women were particularly avid players. Many legends attest to the skill of medieval women chess players. A story from the 14th century France tells of a princess whose father ordered an enemy to engage his daughter in a game of chess. If the challenger won, he would live and sleep with the princess. If he lost, he would lose his head. The princess, a much better player, deliberately threw the game, to her dismay and her opponent's eventual regret. The man chivalrously refused to claim his winnings. Another skilled chess player was Queen Jeanne of Portugal, who frequently defeated her husband. The king, infuriated, would retaliate with his fists. When he was captured by the Turks while on a crusade, the queen had her revenge. She refused to ransom him, and he was held captive for 12 years. With this profusion of expert women players, it is not surprising that in the 15th century, the vizier was superseded by the queen as the most powerful piece on the board. This change reflected the fact that medieval European monarchs had no first ministers, and the power at the time was wielded by such female rulers as Catherine de' Medici. 2 centuries later, backgammon appeared in its modern form in the British Isles. The origin of the name is in dispute, deriving either from Saxon words for backgame, or more descriptively, the Welsh phrase meaning little battle. For a long time, it was a favorite among country clergymen, and stigma eventually overcome when the game enjoyed a brief vogue among London intellectuals in the late 1930s. The Descendant of Nard and Tabula is again popular today, experiencing a revival among modern Neros of the jet-set leisure class. Also in the 17th century, people all over Europe suddenly went wild over a new game, the royal game of goose. The game, invented in Florence by Francesco di Medici, featured dice and a 63-squared spiral track. Certain squares were marked with pictures denoting bonuses or penalties. Landing on a goose square, for instance, meant that the turn could be repeated, while a player whose marker landed on a prison square was required to remain there until another marker replaced it. The game adapted itself well to the peculiarities of national character. In France, it became Le Grand Jeu d'Amour, the Grand Game of Love, while the Germans whiled away the hours over Das Kaiserspiel, the Kaiser's Game, and Kriegsspiel, the War Game. Sailors brought games from Europe and the Orient to the New World, and the New England Puritans, frowning on sinful card-playing, declared board games godly enough, and the port of Salem became the center of a booming game industry. In 1841, the Salem firm of S.B. Ives published the first native board game of the Americas, The Mansion of Happiness. The game would have made Cotton Mather almost sinfully jubilant. Designed to lead children along the straight and narrow path, the game featured squares containing lurid pictures of such vices as Sabbath breaking, drunkenness, and ingratitude. Landing on one sent the player to the pillories, the stocks, or the house of correction. A few years later, a game of even greater moral uplift appeared on the American scene, the game of Pope or Pagan, or the siege of the stronghold of Satan by the Christian army, was soulful entertainment at its 19th century best. The puritanical loved them, but the kids didn't. In the middle of the century, a Salem schoolboy named George Parker decided to create his own games. Tired of having his fun ruined by moralizing, he invented banking, in which players wheeler-dealed their way to success. The one gaining the most money declared the winner. The true mansion of happiness, it turned out, was a bank. An instant success, banking was quickly followed by speculation, corner grocery, Yankee peddler, country auction, and eventually the biggest selling published board game of all time, Monopoly. Invented in the midst of the Depression by an unemployed engineer, Monopoly has been translated into 30 languages, been banned in Russia as a capitalist tool, and has given rise to such spectacular events as marathon tournaments. The record is 1,008 hours. Underwater playing, underground playing, and elevator matches, and Shades of Mogul Rulers matches played on city blocks using real people as pieces. Shelley Berman attributes the game's popularity to the thrill you get when you know you've wiped out a friend financially. At the request of NASA, Parker Brothers has created 2 special Monopoly sets to be used by astronauts whiling away the hours on the first flight to the moon. Why? Why, from the Egyptian pharaohs to outer space astronauts, have board games so permeated human history? Aldous Huxley offers an explanation. With their simple, unequivocal rules, games are like so many islands of order in the vague, untidy chaos of experience. In games, one passes from the incomprehensible universe of given reality into a neat little man-made world where everything is clear, purposive, and easy to understand.